Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Auto-Biography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 11. Wigglesworth was certainly a little demented. "How do you know your name ought to be Jack Engle? It's right, of course. Oh, of course. But why don't you inquire? Inquire of whom? Who knows? Perhaps I know. Perhaps Covert knows. Perhaps Ephraim Foster knows." These were some of the sagacious remarks of Wigglesworth, jerked out now and then, when no one was in the office but we two. Since his conversion to Methodism, the old man had altogether given up drinking, and the result was that without the stimulant which had been his accustomed support for 50 years, he felt low-spirited enough at times. He looked worse than ever, and, after taking the advice of Ephraim, I counseled the old man to indulge himself moderately in drinking, for it was now too late. Wigglesworth stood with one foot in the grave, and, to deprive him totally of drink, we thought likely, under the circumstances, to do him more harm than good. If he had reformed in that respect years before, however, he would no doubt have now been a healthier and a happier man. With respect to my name being what appears at the head of this autobiography, all that I know about it was this, for Ephraim and Violet had informed me of as much, and it tallied with my own recollection. Jack Engle was the name whereby I called myself, and remembered being called among the very few who use more than my first appellative. It was the name which I gave at our first acquaintance to Violet's serious questionings. Moreover, the morning I came, in my rags, to the benevolent milkman's door, I was wearing in my ear a ring, some 3/4 of an inch in diameter, which I never remembered being put there, but which I knew had hung there as long as my childish memory could know anything about it. It was a plain, round ring, with a thick square bar straight across the lower quarter, and somehow had stuck to me through all my wanderings. Probably this good luck was attributable to the fact that the ring, in its dimness and dirt, passed for nothing more valuable than brass. Upon an examination which Violet made soon after their adoption of me, this ring proved to be of gold. The little crossbar was double, and when the two parts were separated, there was plainly to be seen, on the one which was concealed before, the words Jack Engle, a discovery which so confirmed my juvenile traditions that Ephraim and his wife concluded to give up their first intention of bestowing upon me their own name. Besides, they had some honest religious scruples about their right to make any change. Who knew but what I had been christened with that name? A year afterward, an incident occurred which, although perhaps of no importance, may as well be mentioned here, for it was one of my very few links which had any connection with the mystery of who the deuce I was and whence I came. Our pious acquaintance, once casually alluded to in the last chapter, Mr. Kelvin Peterson, eked out a frequently scanty living by taking boarders. Kelvin wouldn't have any but pious ones, and his accommodations were not very select. One of his inmates, perhaps 2 years subsequent to the period described in the second chapter, where I do myself the honor of making the reader's acquaintance, was a middle-aged man who stayed with the Petersons only a couple of weeks, waiting the departure of a brig in which he was going to take passage for a port in South America. The man said very little about himself, except that he was bound abroad with the intention of bettering his fortunes, and had no particular idea of soon returning. Once, when I was there playing with Tom Peterson, a boy of my own age, this man, hearing him call my name in full, came down on the back stoop, and I remember his standing so long and looking so gravely at me that I noticed it, and felt a childish feeling of annoyance. The next morning he came around to Ephraim's, asked for me, drew me to his side, and looking at me again as before, inquired of Ephraim how I came to be there. Ephraim told him the history of the morning 2 years previous, and added what he had learned from me of my former life. The man said he knew more concerning me than would do any good to tell, and that the name I went by was the right one. There were 2 big tears under his eyes as he kissed me on the cheek. He thanked God over and over again that I had fallen in such good protection. He lifted his hands over me and fervently invoked a blessing on me. He was a devout man, as Mrs. Peterson informed Violet afterward, and, telling Ephraim that he might hear from him again at some future time, if he ever returned from abroad, our strange visitor departed. But the trouble of my names, or an inquiry into my parentage, formed about the slightest of mine or Ephraim's cares. The vagabond child had not been left for 20 years uncared for except by strangers, and unasked for, to make it likely that there would suddenly arise some mighty important story to throw a romance about him and his affairs. I was not such a fool as to suppose so. When I thought about it at all, which was very seldom, my mind had no other point to arrive at than the plain and evident supposition that my pedigree, if traced at all, as it appeared likely would never be the case, would be found in the lowest grade of society, and that my parents were doubtless dead long before this time. Faith! It seemed just now as if there were a combination to agitate this subject, and hardly anything else. For in addition to poor, crazy old Wigglesworth's mutterings, Lawyer Covert sent for Ephraim, and, under pretense of being interested in me, made minute inquiries concerning all the facts with which the reader is already acquainted. He even made Ephraim sit down and repeat them to him deliberately. The morning when I came for my breakfast, the history of the cross-barred ring, and the incident of the stranger and his visit. Probably it was that Mr. Covert, in the activity of his heart, amused himself with making a fanciful story for me, when he had nothing else to do. Often afterwards, when I looked up from the desk, wearied and inwardly cursing the whole science of law, with all its appurtenances and hereditaments, I would behold Mr. Covert gazing fixedly at me in what appeared to me a curious manner. At the time I paid no attention to these things, nor to several other incidents that happened, and peculiarities in his treatment toward me. It was only after other developments were made that I recalled them. Of these we shall have a true account in the course of the story. That was Chapter 11 of Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an Autobiography, in which the reader will find some familiar characters, by Walt Whitman. Read by Frank Blissett.